What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Iron Culture, presented by the Mass Research Review. It is me, Eric Trexler, joined as always by the Dr. Eric Helms. Helms, how are we doing tonight?
I'm doing well. We've got amazing powerlifting. We've got cool new preprints on very, very nerdy things that are close to your and I heart. And I trained this morning, and I'm going to train this evening. And I've been able to continue that schedule in an auto-regulated fashion, distributing my training around my schedule. I got a 6 and 6, 6 a.m., 6 p.m., and I'm just living the insane life of me.
Look at you, two-a-days. You are like a early to mid 2000s Animal Pack advertisement. You know, life sucks. Everybody hates me. I hate the world. It's just me in the gym twice a day. All obviously in a black and white print.
Yeah, with strong overtones of a sense of superiority, but also wishing I didn't have to do this thing that I absolutely don't have to do.
Yeah, there's three layers. There's the superiority, the angst, which is a weird thing to mix with superiority, but it's still there. And then, yeah, if only there were any way out of the thing that no one's asking me to do, no one wants me to do, no one's depending on me to do, I simply do it at my own volition. Those were the days. If there are any young folk who listen, I don't believe there are, but if there are, you'll have to Google some of those old school Animal Pack advertisements. Look at the raw emotion in them, and then remind yourself this is a multivitamin.
Yep. I think people in all eras can understand it if we just, grind culture. Everyone gets that. Now, when grind culture is connected to, oh man, it's a rough economy, the cost of living is higher, the average salary is down, and I have to do this to get through this phase of building my career. But imagine instead of building a career, it was building unnecessarily large biceps.
Yeah.
And now you will understand the flavor of those Animal Pack ads.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, all right, Helms. I can tell you on my end, it's busy times over here. First week of classes, I'm in front of the podium many hours a week. And so it is a lot of fanfare, a lot of excitement, a lot of energy and buzz on campus. Also, a lot of extra work. So, but we're still getting things done. So I can't complain. This is really what it's all for. That's the whole concept of the university enterprise, is that we will, in fact, engage in academic discussion, lectures, etc. So I can't complain. I'm happy. I like the energy around me. But I tell you what, man, let's dive right in here. We got a lot to cover. Before we do that, I need to do all the business stuff. So folks, if you like the show, make sure that you support it in whatever way you see fit. Options would include like, rate, subscribe, review, tell a friend, share the link with a friend, get people involved, get them into the Iron Cult. On top of that, if you want to support our friends and support us while doing it, we have our dear friends at Elite FTS who sell extremely high quality lifting apparel and gear. You want it, whether you know it or not yet, you do in fact want it. I use it on a regular basis. But you go to elitefts.com, you use the discount code MRR10, that stands for Mass Research Review 10. That'll get you 10% off of your order. And finally, if you want to be a platinum level, diamond, gold medallion supporter of the show, the best way to do that, the highest tier of support, is to become a member of the Mass community. That's the Mass Research Review. You can find it at massresearchreview.com, and that is where we review the hottest, freshest, most useful research every single month. The first of the month, never been late since 2017. Every single month, our issues are packed. We have debates often. Are they too packed? Are we overpacking? But yet we decide, no, we need to give the people what they need. And so we pack these issues full of practical, useful, scientific information. We think you're going to love it. And I think that does it for the promotion, Helms. Anything I missed?
No, we're at a point where we have to change the pination angle of Mass just to pack in more content.
Absolutely.
So let's go.
All right, Helms. Well, first and foremost, we need to give powerlifting a little bit of love. It's been a while since you gave like a 41-minute monotone review of a powerlifting event results. So we're not going to do that, but we are going to highlight a single lifter.
Yes, you've restricted some of well, that's not true. You actually took a very, very intelligent approach to essentially mammal behavior, and you can share as much as you would like about powerlifting and bodybuilding. It just results that me being able to share as much as I want about college football and sports in general, and we've come to an agreed upon, maybe more appropriate amount of exposure to both that is palatable to us. It's called compromise, folks.
I think it's called mutually assured destruction is what we've basically... You and I are both posturing with massive caches of essentially weaponry, of just, if you go over that red line with a 41-minute powerlifting monologue, I will tell you all about the UNC game on Saturday and the big year 2 of Bill Belichick and all the hype surrounding it. So we have a very tense standoff, but we honor that zone in the middle that we don't cross.
I like how I framed it as a couple in couples counseling finding compromise. And there's a saying that my dear mother, who's been a marriage and family therapist until she retired, said that you can either be right or you can be in a relationship. And I like how you framed it instead as a catastrophic, world-destroying Cold War between the two of us, which makes me think after this podcast's over, we should have a mild check-in just to make sure that we are good.
No, I don't want to show people behind the curtain too much, but this is good podcasting because you are appealing to one personality type, I'm appealing to the other, and therefore we bring in both of those audiences.
I love it. And at least we have one person who has the attitude of mutuality and connection, because as they say, it takes one to tango. So we're good. In all seriousness, so big shout out to Joshua Joachim. He is a 23-year-old IPF affiliate, PA, as there's been changes to that situation over the years, lifter who just went to the NAPF championships. So this is one of the non-world level but international level meets where you can set world records. He has only been lifting since 2025, or I should say he started competing in 2025, but prior to that he did do strength conditioning, and he's an incredibly strong individual. At 21 in his first meet about a year and a half ago in the 105 kilo class, now you only weighed in at 99, he totaled a little over 800 kilos. Phenomenal. And there is some discussion about that we've had before of where people start with their baseline and it kind of predicting where they can potentially go. And now, a year and a half later, he just did the NAPFs, and there was a really exciting 105 kilo battle that was not anticipated. So there has been a back and forth within the 105s between Keenan Lee as well as Andrew McNaughton, who are top-tier lifters, both vying for being the best 105 from the States. That currently, right now, means they're the best 105 in the world. But out of nowhere, insert reference that younger people don't get. I
gotta be honest, I don't get it either.
Joaquin. It's a wrestling thing,
Okay.
the memes where the guy comes in and does like the neck breaker on people, and they have people who slip and fall, and it looks like Randy. It doesn't matter. This is stupid. I'm old, and internet culture has changed, and I'm unwilling to let that happen without reminding people of the good old days that probably weren't as good. But out of nowhere, Joshua Joachim comes in and totals 960, if I recall correctly, and sets a new world record in the squat and actually beats Keenan Lee. So a third entrant is coming, and this is a massive increase from someone who's at 800. But remembering that if the first meet you have ever is at 800, that's not actually against the predictive trajectory one would have. It just means that some people are very gifted, and perhaps a little bit of mentoring and exposure to the right information could be at play here.
That's what I was going to say.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say big shout out to the FAU Muscle Lab and Dr. Zerdos, because Joshua Joachim is actually a master's. I'm not sure if he's graduated yet or is in the process of doing his master's I should have probably checked in with Dr. Z before I jumped on and started giving praise. But nonetheless, potentially alumni or current master's student, Joshua also. He's studying the sport and exercise. He's doing the good work. Student of the game, as well as someone who's understanding the science. And he's gone to probably the most well-known program out there. And I'm trying to catch him in terms of specifically powerlifting science, and actually where I did the final study of my PhD on autoregulation in powerlifting. So really cool to see that. And I believe he's being coached by I can't remember whether it's Zach or Josh from Data Driven Strength, but also coming from his lab, and they're one of his coaches. So it's really cool to see. And if you're interested in hearing more about this story, he was recently on King of the Lifts, where you will see us often doing YouTube promos together, and I'm one of kind of like the guest host there. But just shout out, impressive performance, powerlifting news, and I'll leave it at that. And if you need to talk about college football, do what you got to do.
No, so just double checking here. So we're talking about a little over a year gap between those meets that you're talking about. Is that right?
Very first meet was, I think, February 2025, and this one just happened.
So a year and a half-ish?
Yeah, about a year and a half.
So a year and a half, going from 800 to 960. For people who prefer more free units, that's going from about 1760 to 2112. So that is, on the surface, seems like a big jump. But again, a testament to Dr. Zordos. That's actually a fairly normal 18-month change when you join his lab. And so if anyone is looking for, like, I don't want to say it's completely typical, but it's not unusual, I would say. So if you're looking at graduate programs and you want to study strength and you are interested in getting strong while doing it, that is approximately what you can expect.
Yeah, I would say that adds up. That made me laugh, not just because it was funny, because part of my brain was wondering, oh, is he going to talk about the modeling data from Latella on powerlifters from first competition to later? I was like, and then you did what you did, and I liked it because it surprised me.
I did what I did because I do what I do. All right, Helms, let's get into some science. I'm not even going to do a petty tit-for-tat college football segment. But Helms, this paper comes across my proverbial desk, also known as my cell phone today, because you send it to me. And this is, I was going to say hot off the presses, but it is not even reaching the presses yet because this is a preprint. No. So it has not been peer reviewed, but a very fresh paper posted August 20th to a preprint server. And the title, this is one of those good titles that tells you exactly what's happening. The energetic cost of building human skeletal muscle. And I saw that alone, and you pitched it as an idea to chat about, and I said, sold. And then I opened the link because this is something that I know it has been on your mind for quite a while. I've, on many occasions, cited a paper that you collaborated on in 2019 called "Is an Energy Surplus Required to Maximize Skeletal Muscle Hypertrophy Associated with Resistance Training?" And I think you guys did a great job with very limited data, as we'll talk about. The idea being, there is some amount of energy that is required to do an anabolic process, in this case building skeletal muscle, but how much? And then ultimately, what are the downstream impacts that would have on our practical recommendations? So, and then just a couple years ago, you guys published a paper which sought to kind of look at different sized calorie surpluses. It's very, very difficult to assign someone an exact surplus, just the realities of biology and human tracking and behavior. And plus COVID made that study, I think it impacted that study to some extent, but nonetheless, the point,
large extent,
to a some too large to huge extent. But in any case, this is something that's been in your crosshairs for a long time. It's been a pretty elusive question. So any addition, especially one that's so on the nose, is obviously going to get our attention and warrant some discussion.
Perfect tee up. Yeah, and for a little bit of background, 2019 was not the first time I was like trying to figure this out, but it was a really cool opportunity to do so with legend in the game, Gary Slater, who is right up there with Grant Tinsley. I'd say he's the upside down Grant Tinsley because he's in Australia, of body composition and kind of understanding the energetics of tissue deposition, like they both do, which is pretty cool. And the first edition of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, when I was trying to give nutrition guidance and, what should your surplus or deficit size was. And ever since, I want to say I came across Hall's maybe '07 paper talking about the 3,500 calorie generality that is not a perfect rule, even though that is the rough energetic content in adipose tissue per pound. And therefore, 500 calorie deficit, lose a pound of fat. And that actually created modeling based upon real world data that Kevin Hall produced that shows that doesn't actually pan out. And there's so much baked into that related to that's not based upon like a metabolic ward study. That's based upon like real world weight loss data. But yeah, going from there and trying to tell people like, hey, when we're seeing mixed deposition of muscle and fat, what is a reasonable calorie intake? I was largely just trying to back calculate from the very few studies we have of looking at rates of weight gain and the supposed energy surplus that would therefore be there based upon then the eventual change, and essentially making recommendations that should minimize fat gain, but then saying, oh, by the way, and that's totally dependent upon like adherence, training effectiveness, how quickly you can grow, and literally everything else. And finding some like textbook mentions, but never really being able to drill down the actual math or empirical validation of how much does it quote unquote cost to build X units of muscle mass in people. And I would say even if you were, I think a lot of people are hoping to get something close to that when they read the 2019 paper that we did with Slater. But I remember writing that article. We got to a point where we went, we can't. We can point out all the places where this energy should be coming from and all the things that are happening. And we took a stance of going, hey, let's take someone who's completely untrained, and then they start lifting weights. What all might contribute to their need to increase calories, and where might that come from? And I think we did a good job of identifying them, estimating some of them, and then looking at the empirical data and making some recommendations for calorie increases that you should try to maximize, actual body composition outcomes. But we were not able to say, and that's because, this is the energetic cost of building muscle. And I think this is the first time I've seen, and I think we both want to say this caveat is neither one of us has done like a deep dive review, mass research, or peer review level of assessment of this. I did read it when it came out on the day it came out because, my inbox blew up, right? All my alerts went off.
Yeah, but we're not going to give the level of insight where we say, you know what, I think they forgot to carry the one here.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I've read it. It's very interesting. And I think at the very least, they do a very robust job with the available data of creating some ring fencing and making what is an empirically testable hypothesis to say, hey, we think we've calculated all this. And then if we could do some types of controlled studies, it's very challenging to generate a kilogram of muscle tissue gain, even in an animal model, like predictably. And then if you do, isolating the components of energy expenditure and intake, as we'll talk about, that are contributing to it. But nonetheless, I think this does form at least some empirical basis for hypothesis testing, which would be kind of cool to see like, hey, do we think this is in the realm of reasonable? So this is probably, I think a lot of people are going to read this and probably inappropriately apply it to how much they should modify their calories by. And I think probably what should be used more frequently in this case is that other researchers take a look at it and consider how do we actually get closer to answering this question. And this provides them a theoretical basis to therefore make testable hypotheses. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we ought to keep the train rolling here. So I'm you're more familiar with the paper than I am, so I'm inclined to let you take the steering wheel and kind of decide how we navigate this, how much of this specific paper we want to dig into, and then how much we want to break it out into practical applications. So I'm handing it back to you. I trust you. Please don't let me down.
As you know, I value trust, and I also am someone who needs some reining in. That's why we have two of us. So while you trust me, and while I will take that baton, I'm also handing you one of those old school, huge, big hooks that if the person gives too long of a speech at the Oscars, you pull on me. So please, you have permission to interrupt and say, Helms, I don't know that we need to talk about that aspect of this. Let's get focused on what our podcast listeners care about. Agreed?
Agreed.
Okay. So I think the first thing to talk about is what they delineated as the components to building a kilogram of muscle tissue. So they had what they would describe as 5 additive components. So stored tissue energy, which is worth talking about because that's something that is already used in the literature and is heavily involved in the discussion we had on body recomposition and the methods that we have used and others have used to infer deficits or surplus sizes when we're looking at studies that have done robust body composition testing and trying to determine if the group over the net period of time that was measured in a study was in a surplus, deficit, maintenance, or somewhere in between. Okay. The next component is the biochemical synthesis cost. So this is actually the cost of building the protein, the actual components to skeletal muscle, which is not just protein, but predominantly protein. And then there's the physiological deposition cost, which is not just building the tissue, but incorporating it and depositing it into making it actual full-blown skeletal muscle. And then there is the resting maintenance during accretion. And this is saying, hey, guess what? We exist not at a single point in time where these things instantaneously happens, but if you're building muscle and then you are keeping it while you're therefore building more muscle. So instead of thinking of it as we're just going to build a kilogram, but we're in the energetic state and rate over a given unit of time that we're in process continually of building a kilogram of muscle. So let's say we're building a kilogram of muscle per week. This is the cost on a weekly basis of therefore always building 1 kilogram of muscle. Okay, that is the resting maintenance during accretion cost. And then finally, there's diet-induced thermogenesis. And this is something that you should be familiar with, also known as the thermic effect of feeding, TEF, and it is built into TDEE, which I think is a great jumping to the next point that we can talk about after we just give the numbers. And this is saying, hey, that when you eat stuff and then you do things with it, there is, a tax, right? Yeah. We don't have a perfect energetic machine where we can turn chemical mass into bioenergetic energy that is then converted into tissues. Sound good?
Sounds good. Yeah, I'm sure people are on the edge of their seat wanting to know, what are these numbers?
Yeah. So I think what a lot of people who are, I'd say, outcome focused and practical application focused, and this would be an error because we talked about we don't think this is what you should actually do with this information. We'll go, cool. So what's the value? And now I know how to prescribe surpluses. Wrong. It's roughly 3,500 calories, which is nice. Now we get to have a 3,500 calorie rule per pound for fat loss and a 3,500 calorie per kilogram for lean tissue. But that's actually not the way to do it.
Correct, but that is convenient, and we should say 3481 for the people who are far too concerned about the details to let that slide. But yes, approximately 3,500.
Yes, with I think the what the confidence interval spans like about 200-ish calories on either end of that. So there's an uncertainty around that. So it's not incompatible with the 3,500 kcal per kilogram rule.
Oh, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, cool. So that would mean that you would only need to be divide that by time to build that much muscle mass in a given time period. So you could derive a weekly surplus if you thought you could build a kilogram of tissue per week. I would propose that you probably cannot, but over any given unit of time, and you could bootstrap that to your training age, you could do that. But I don't think you should. it would be my take-home message, because there's far too many assumptions about building exclusively muscle tissue. And furthermore, there is I would say largely an academic distinction between surplus size and the amount you might increase your energy intake if you were completely new to to building muscle, but somehow already lifting weights, because we haven't talked about, like we did in Slater, the cost of lifting weights.
Yeah.
We actually approached that from, I don't lift weights, I'm going to start lifting weights and I'm going to build muscle, and we included that in there as a potential energetic cost. This is literally just talking about, hey, whatever you're doing doesn't count, but it's resulting in a kilogram of lean mass being built, and that's that cost, which I think is a notable distinction between Slater. And by the way, we've been avoiding, probably just because we're going to get it wrong, giving the authors their props, because they have very, very, I believe, Greek last names, if I had to guess. So we're looking at Michaelis G. Nicolaitis, Vasilis Paschalis, and Nikos V. Margaritelis. And if I got that wrong for any of the three of you, my apologies, but I do want to give you your propers and attempt at least to pronounce your names right. So this is a new paper by Nicolaitis et al., if you will. So, Trex.
Yeah, I was hoping maybe you'd be willing to elaborate a little bit more on that difference between increasing your calories a certain amount versus going for a particular surplus. Because I'm sure a lot of people, most people presume, I wouldn't say always, but many people, when they say, I'm going to endeavor to build new muscle starting prospectively, they're approximately at maintenance, and therefore they're thinking increasing calories and establishing a surplus of X amount. Those are functionally the same thing in their mind. So if you could kind of pick that apart a little bit, I think that would add some extra context.
Absolutely. And I think probably the easiest way to do that is to go back to some of the things that we've discussed previously when we were talking about our protein meta-regression that we did with the good Dr. Ruffalo, who led it, as well as our probably in-depth, maybe overly in-depth discussions of body recomposition, where we caught some misguided heat on the internet because there was questions as related to the energy content of adipose tissue or muscle versus lean mass versus what we would call a fat mass on a DEXA scan. And there are different values for each of these, but if you are appropriately looking at them using the right methods, you can back calculate an estimation of whether a group or a person was in a net surplus, deficit, or maintenance, like I talked about before. So in our meta-regression, what we used was a 9,400 and roughly 1,800 calorie value for lean mass, not muscle, as well as fat mass, not adipose tissue, because all of the studies that we regressed, or the vast majority of them, were using DEXA. And as we discussed not too long ago in one of our episodes, the way DEXA assesses these things, because of what the x-rays bounce off of, is that lean mass needs to be basically everything except fat mass, and it includes includes bone, because the way that the x-rays bounce off tissue, it can't well distinguish between water, glycogen, and muscle tissue. It can distinguish between bone, and it can distinguish between fat mass, but not the contents of adipose tissue that are, water or structural proteins or other aspects, because that is counted towards lean mass. So when we look at the change in a DEXA scan, we can back calculate and go, hey, you lost a kilogram of fat, but you gained a kilogram of lean mass. We would take 9,400, subtract 1,800, and we would have that as the net deficit you were probably in, even though we saw neutral change in body weight. And that is still correct, no matter what numbers we talk through next. And I think that's where people get tripped up.
Yeah.
So that is basically saying we don't know anything about your TDEE, right?
Correct.
All I know is that for your body composition to have changed in this way, there must have been this amount of liberation of body stores of energy and this amount of deposition of body stores of energy, and therefore the net result over the given time looked at was this degree of a deficit. That is still true. And that is quite different than how much you may need to increase your calories, or what you will see happen in the real world with your caloric intake based upon all of the things that go into building muscle. So that's the first thing that I want to caveat this with. So the stored tissue energy is how we back calculate surplus or deficit size. But everything else from these 5 additive components, they are not going to tell us much about the actual technical science, like that you would derive an empirical study surplus that you'd be in. They're accounted for in the costs of energy expenditure. So they'd be adding to your TDE, your total daily energy expenditure. So let's go through them. We have the biochemical synthesis. This is the cost side of the equation of energy balance of building the tissue, or rather the components to the tissue. The physiological deposition cost is making that into the muscle, right? The resting maintenance during accretion is the increase in TDEE from maintaining that muscle, like we talked about. And then the diet-induced thermogenesis, you already understand, dear listener, probably, if you followed our content or engaged in this world a little bit, is the cost of turning the food into the energy to do these things. And all 4 of those are actually going to be things that contribute to your daily energy expenditure. And when we look at those kind of in 2 distinct categories, the stored tissue energy of muscle, not lean mass, is 1355 kcals per kilogram, which is close to but not exactly the same as the roughly 1800 calorie figure we have for lean mass, because muscle is not lean mass. It doesn't include all of those other elements like glycogen. Well, I don't want to get too in depth because now there is glycogen in muscle, so I'm going to take a step back and say I haven't read close enough, but lean mass isn't the same thing as muscle, so these values being different is not an indictment of either one being wrong or right, but they're different.
Lean mass is averaged across shifts in body water and organ content and skin. So all these different fat-free masses have these different, basically if you look at Kevin Hall's paper where he models it out, he goes into tremendous detail talking about, when I say that lean mass, has an energy density of blank, that's averaged across all these different lean mass categories.
Perfect. Yes. And the other roughly 2,000 kcals that go into 1 kilogram are every of the other 4 components added up together. So I think the interesting thing here is to think, hold on. The 3,500 calorie rule for fat that we use is just basically taking the 9 calories per gram. It's not a perfect estimation. It's a heuristic. It's close for pure triglyceride. And then going, okay, adipose tissue is X% that and X% other stuff. And then dividing that into what a pound would be from that, right?
Yeah.
That's where the 3,500 calorie estimation comes from. And that is purely, if we were to say, apply these same categories to fat, that's just the actual stored tissue energy, right?
Correct, yeah.
And that is a decent heuristic that we haven't completely abandoned, because losing fat is far less biochemically costly than building muscle. You're essentially just kind of opening some stuff up and pulling triglycerides out. That fat mass is very efficiently stored and even more efficiently liberated, right? Because you don't even need to build new tissue. And we've talked about how there's some potential things with water in the fat cell that change that even make that process more efficient, which is kind of neat. Very different to building muscle. There's the majority of the cost, as you can see, is actually on the energy outside. If we thought about what does it cost to burn fat, it's minuscule, right? So what does that mean? Well, if you are a Kevin Hall, if you are someone who's doing metabolic ward research, and if you were to actually find an empirical way to test this hypothesis, and you had the perfect God machine to measure all elements of TDEE down to this degree of specificity, and all elements of body composition change with perfect reliability and accuracy, you would not see what someone might do and we recommend should not do, a surplus size of 3481 divided by time. What you would see is a surplus size of 1355, just the just the stored tissue energy component divided by units of time, because everything else actually increased your energy expenditure. So technical surplus is only what you consume beyond that. And I think it's an important thing to remember, because shows the distinction between the real world and the theoretical here. Because what you'll actually have to do is going to depend upon other factors, but also a lot of other factors that aren't even taken into account here, right? So let's say you're not lifting weights, and we're in that Slater situation. And if we kind of combine Slater plus this, and you start building muscle at a rate of, let's say, a kilogram per month, which isn't too unreasonable with a decent program if you're untrained, then your daily surplus, if it's let's say I don't know, a 30-day month is 3,481 divided by 30, right? And I can't math that out live, and I'm not going to try. 13? Something like that. Why am I trying? Trex, this is where you need the hook.
Yeah, you said you promised you wouldn't try.
And I did. So it would be that plus exercise activity energy expenditure on average across a day divided by 30, and also potentially an increase in NEAT, right? Which we also know is highly variable. And that would be your experience as a new lifter needing to increase your calories relative to you were before. And that's why you get these anecdotes of, very spendthrift, or I should say thrifty, young, college-aged, men who are increasing their calories by 1,000 and they can't gain weight, right? All those factors together. And that's also why we have the experience of a well-trained lifter trying to build this amount of muscle and ultimately falling into the fallacy of wishing that they were, who they used to be, and largely gaining fat tissue, right? Yeah. Because they don't have the capacity to build the kilogram over the time they're talking about. And neither one of those instances invalidates the necessarily potentially accurate calculations here, which I think is really important.
Yeah.
Now, if you were let's say you're already lifting, but what you're doing currently is insufficient to build any muscle, and you managed to change your training program in a way that didn't increase the energy expenditure, which is unlikely, but it's possible. Let's say you were doing a high volume but really low, far from failure, poor exercise selection. You're managing to do cardio with weights.
Listen, Helms.
And you go, actually, hold on.
I'm going to give you license to do this because most of the physics problems I've ever dealt with in my life are like, assume that wind doesn't exist and make all these irrational assumptions. So we're going to borrow from physics and create whatever conditions we like.
Thank you. So I didn't get the hook, but I got you're close, buddy, and I'll allow it this time. All right. So if we assume that your training has a given energy expenditure and you manage to actually make it effective, maybe you reduce junk volume and you increase proximity to failure and you swap out exercises with better resistance profiles, whatever magic you need to accept this as a physics change. But it becomes effective enough to build a kilogram of muscle tissue, you would need to increase your calories over whatever unit of time that happened by 3,481 divided by 30, but you still would not be in that amount of a surplus. Again, you would only be in 1355 divided by that amount of time of a surplus. The rest would be added to your TDEE. How did I do, Trex?
I think you did a lovely job, and if you give me one second, I'm getting a call from the fact-checking department. And they are telling me that initial calculation, the 3,500-ish divided by 30, that ends up being 116 calories per day over that 30-day span. And then if we're dividing out just that surplus value you were talking about, that 1,355 divided by 30, that ends up being 45 calories a day.
Okay, so I said the wrong thing, but I got one of them partially right. So those aren't necessarily useful pieces of information. I think that's the whole thing. This is really, really interesting, but I just want to really stress how much I don't want people to do what I've already seen them doing, and what they're going to do inevitably is that to take this to justify whether or not you should be in larger or smaller surpluses and go, look, it doesn't take much to build muscle. We don't need huge surpluses. And I would say that is absolutely true. But there are so much more that goes into, and they dwarf these numbers, what is potentially impacting your total daily energy expenditure. And there is so much more that goes into your ability to actually build a given amount of muscle. And it's taken me, for example, 2 years to build about 2 kilograms of lean mass, not even necessarily muscle tissue, that increased my stage weight. And I can't, even with what I have access to at Sprints, figure out all the different components to it, and neither can you. And they had to, in this theoretical paper, borrow from animal model studies, make assumptions even based upon interesting studies on growing meat in a lab to double check it. They had some really cool ways of building a defensible, empirical, informed model. I won't say it's empirical because it is theoretical. And then checking it against things. They said, hey, if we look at this component of these 5 additive values in animals, which we can test, can't do it in humans, it seems to be at least reality checked. It's in the same range. And there's a reason why we should expect animals to have a different value anyway, so that is plausible. If we grow meat in a lab, it doesn't have these components, and we've estimated them at that amount. And if we only have these 3 of those 5 additive components for growing meat in a lab, and it looks like it's the right amount, minus those other 2 components, okay, that is also reality checked. And they go through that in every way that is possible. And by the time you are done reading it, which I did read, I didn't find myself going, whoa, they made a major error, they missed this. So again, I haven't peer reviewed this. It hasn't gone through any peer review, nor am I the appropriate type of expert to really evaluate certain claims that they're making. But this is something that I have been thinking about for 11 years, more directly and fully aware of all the things that went into it versus just kind of seeing what happens in the real world as a trainer or as my own personal experience as a bodybuilder. And I am inappropriately excited about this paper is what I would say, Trex.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really cool paper. And I think, even just the superficial interpretation helps anchor us into some reality. Not that there are that many holdouts, but back in the day, people would talk about going on these, 6,000 calorie diets, gaining pounds and pounds and pounds a month, saying you have to do this to get big. That is a nice kind of sanity check or reality check to kind of look at the number and say, okay, maybe I don't need to be eating the same amount as like a Tour de France cyclist just because I'm a sedentary person who wants to gain a few pounds of muscle this year. So that's good. And also it reiterates that this is an energy consuming process, and putting putting an estimated number on that, I think makes it a little more real and tangible. One question I have is, we've talked about how there are a lot of challenges when it comes to taking this number at face value and then just adding it straight to your diet. One thing I think we ought to address, which brings us back to our body recomposition topic, is those types of conversations seem to necessarily assume that you cannot liberate stored body energy elsewhere to fuel some of these processes. So how would you address that particular question or comment?
That's a really tough one. And I think you're right. This is essentially, I think the authors might have even acknowledged this, is that we're kind of looking at a theoretical model of where all other body stores are held constant.
Right.
And are also not impacting this. And that we are actually seeing muscle building as a separate system. And while they are separate tissues, and you aren't actually seeing what, like your high school buddy would have said, like, oh, you just got to turn that muscle, you got to turn that fat into muscle. Maybe the intention, if with the most charitable view of what they're saying, is that, and it's actually well shown, going back to our body recomposition episodes, that yes, when there is a large, strong drive and a capability in an organic system to build a lot of lean tissue, you will often see a decrease in fat mass because there is just a starvation of a starvation of energy going into the fat mass, so it comes down to allow that to go up. It's not being transformed into a new type of tissue. We're not turning triglyceride into protein, but certainly at least that is happening, if not even some signaling factors potentially from muscle gain reducing fat mass, and that there is sort of a systemic shift, at least within I would say, relative energy deficiency in sport states, or being far below your lower end body composition, like intervention point. But when you've got when your body is saying, hey, everything functions just fine. I'm fine if I'm losing fat mass. I'm fine if I'm gaining fat mass. I'm fine if I'm gaining or losing lean mass. Then absolutely, Trex, I think what we would potentially see is that some of the costs of the deposition for lean mass, or muscle tissue rather, would and could come from fat mass going down, or other, potential energy stores in the body going down to fuel that.
Yeah.
And that is actually, I think, just for everyone to think about it, almost always assuredly, given how many tissues and cells there are in the body, going on at some point, somewhere in your body at some point during the day.
Yeah.
And this is just that happening in a more macro scale over time. And absolutely, I think you would this could happen. Again, this doesn't change the name of the game. It doesn't say, hey, all of a sudden now everything we talk about body recomposition is wrong. You have to be in a surplus, and it has to be this amount to build muscle, and it'll increase your TDE this amount. It's saying this is the amount of energy it costs to build muscle. Where you get that energy, that's up to you and the rest of your body. And if your body is in a state of low energy availability, you're really, really lean, and it's going, I'm going to keep my body fat where it's at, then yeah, you might need to be in a surplus. And that could be, a real world example of what does that look like. It's someone just on the other side of recovery, but still reasonably lean, who has muscle building capability, say post contest or post diet. Now they're like, hey, listen, I prefer you to be in a surplus. I don't want to really build muscle in a deficit or even in maintenance, because it would require me to tap into this. And until they get into that energetic status, some clamp, quote unquote, in the body is going to prevent the deposition of muscle tissue, regardless of the cost of what it hypothetically would be. Likewise, if you are someone who is very high in body fat and you're in a modest deficit and you have a very effective training program, all good. We can absolutely subsidize that cost from our adipose tissue fund, I think is the way I would probably describe that.
Yeah, so basically what I was setting up, and I put it on the tee and you nailed it. The idea is, again, when we are critiquing this idea of taking the numbers straight from page to diet, we have to remember there are going to be other, potentially, depending on your physiological state, non-dietary sources of energy that can be footing some of the bill here in terms of the cost, which means you may not need to increase your energy intake a given amount to achieve a given amount of growth. One other thing I would raise, I think they did a tremendous job identifying, they called their shots and they stuck to them. They said, we are quantifying 5 components. The 5 components are thusly, and they listed them. Then they quantified them. One thing that they notably didn't quantify, because it's damn hard to quantify in a generalizable way, we've seen these overfeeding studies where they sit somebody down and say, we're going to feed you an amount of food that will make you not want to eat for another month. And we're going to overfeed you and overfeed you and overfeed you. And what we tend to find is that there's tremendous variance from person to person, where some people have enormous increases in their energy expenditure in response to this overfeeding. Other people much more readily gain fat. There's not such a robust increase, and the extra calories go straight to body stores. And so that variable degree of extra energy expenditure in response to overfeeding is not fully captured by what they're quantifying here as diet-induced thermogenesis. It varies a lot from person to person. It's not actually contributing to the muscle growth. It's just sucking up calories away from that particular effort. And so therefore, I think what I'm getting at, Helms, what I know I'm getting at is we may find scenarios where your actual dietary needs to support muscle growth are much lower than would be implied by this number, and other scenarios where they may be much higher, right? Plenty of body fat. You may not have to increase your calories that much to fuel growth. On the other hand, if you're someone who has a very robust increase in energy expenditure when you overfeed due to increases in fidgeting and other types of NEAT, you may find cool paper, but you miss this huge thing that really colors my entire experience when I'm trying to bulk up. And so I think just to kind of reinforce your point from a different angle, this does not solve the age-old problem of seems like everybody's bulking on some different calories, and you kind of got to figure out where you are.
Well said. And I think, yeah, so this doesn't change the game, but it does help us get closer to understanding things. And I think even a lot of people and a younger me would be a little more dismissive of kind of this mechanistic speculation stuff and be very, very outcome focused, because then it tells me what to do. But I think now, as I've been a scientist for, my God, 14 years, actively researching and thinking about this stuff, I have seen so many instances where a fundamental misunderstanding of the underlying physiology meaningfully impacts, because we don't have empirical observations of everything. We have a lot of gaps in sports science and sports nutrition. It meaningfully impacts our interpretation of what we see anecdotally, and also our theoretical prescriptions in the absence of good evidence, in such ways that they can be fundamentally wrong. And I think a great example of this, in my opinion, is that the modeling of how muscle growth has a curvilinear slowing down over time of an advanced lifter being misunderstood as various different ways has encouraged some recommendations that I think are counter to actually how it works. Like, you're getting quote unquote anabolic resistance, which is not wrong, but then the idea that to overcome it, you need to be in a really big surplus, and then you just have to deal with the fat gain and frequently mini cut as an advanced lifter. But in reality, and I think this is the most appropriate interpretation, and you can see how it's fundamentally important to understand this question specifically. If you can only gain so much muscle tissue over a given time, then that means the bottleneck for your growth is almost never energetic, because you only need a very small amount. And that actually means that body recomposition is, of course, plausible, because you're talking about small changes over a small period. It's either a large change over a very long period of time, or it's a very small change over a short period of time. And in neither case do you need a large daily surplus. And it wouldn't be much of a hindrance if you have timing and everything else in your life good to go, and you're not too lean, and you're not in a state of reds, of being at maintenance or even a slight deficit. So that is a fundamentally different conclusion and set of recommendations that you would make based upon not understanding the underlying physiology, beyond kind of that heuristic, correct but not specific enough understanding of, oh, there's anabolic resistance. Sure, but can you overcome it by just eating more protein or more of a surplus? Apparently not. And then, okay, if that anabolic resistance limits the amount of tissue growth we can have, then what does that mean for our energy intake? Because the energy intake is a very, very poor, at best, stimulus for growth of the type of tissue we care about. And training, even if you optimize it, is mostly throttled. The main thing that's going to impact it by how close you are to, or basically how much you've grown already, is probably the best way to put it, that is impossibly wrong, that they couldn't be wrong in the future. So therefore, energy is not the constraint, like it might be when you could grow really fast as a novice, and this becomes useful. So that's just an example. So I will just say that I think I have generated much more respect over time with a more accurate understanding of the mechanisms of muscle growth, body composition change, and human metabolism, because there's been enough times where it's meaningfully changed the narrative once we understand it, because I can actually justify a recommendation, or I can say that doesn't make sense because of this, to where it's had a positive impact on the outcomes that people experience, and doesn't lock them into a certain paradigm of thinking or an approach that may not be ideal for their lifestyle, their goals, their preferences, or even just the actual outcome itself. So yeah, I'll say that. And the last thing I will say, because you got another angle on this is how this should be interpreted, I also want to be really clear, is we're not telling you how you should interpret these researchers' work. The researchers are saying the same thing, and I quote, "The purpose is not to define an invariant biological constant or a prescriptive daily energy surplus, but to provide a transparent, tissue-specific quantitative reference estimate against which claims concerning skeletal muscle accretion and its energetic requirements can be evaluated." And that's the last sentence in the introduction, which is where, if you know science, the authors say, okay, I just gave you all this background. Here's what this is for. And if you take it another way, you're saying, thank you, authors. I appreciate this dinner, and I am going to use it to build a nice painting of like, hot dog, mustard, and ketchup. And they're like, what the F, man? I just gave you this hot dog to eat, and you said, no, I want to paint a picture with it. Don't paint pictures with hot dogs, is what I'm saying. If someone gives you a hot dog and they offer you to eat it, either politely say no thank you, or eat the hot dog. Those are your options.
Exactly. Yeah. So that they begged you not to repurpose their work for applications it was not designed for, such as you eloquently put it, painting pictures with hot dogs. Uh, so I think if I can just get one little mini rant off my chest, this is something I've been sitting on for a while, and this is a pertinent time to bring it up. We have talked about the scenarios in which, this number may, give you some really solid, useful information for how you might make a dietary adjustment, but also physiological states and scenarios where, you may have minimal need to really lean too much on dietary energy to fuel growth, and other cases where your needs, due to stuff not even mentioned in this paper, you may have skyrocketed needs to actually fuel growth because you have a very adaptive metabolism, particularly in the upward direction during overfeeding. And in many cases, that leads one to the refrain that has been increasingly driving me nuts lately, which is some version of, well, everybody's different.
Yeah.
Now, is that true? Yes. But increasingly online, I've seen a lot of people justifying very indefensible ideas and ending their argument with, it's all about the individual. Everybody's different. What are you going to do? And I think here is my very short mini rant, but I challenge all people, when you feel the urge to say everybody's different or it depends on the individual, I encourage you, I insist, I implore you, explain to me what the difference is. What is the domain or dimension upon which people differ? And preferably tell me the range of variance we expect to see in the general population or any unique population you have in mind. So for example, when I say, hey, some people don't gain a lot of fat in direct, controlled overfeeding studies, I can tell you this is the parameter by which people vary, and I can bring you to the paper which shows here's a very high response, here's a very low response, and here's the normal or typical response. So my concern is every time I make some conclusion where I say, you're going to have to figure this out at the individual level, you're figuring it out based on known parameters with known boundaries and ranges of variance. So I just wanted to reiterate that and kind of warn people that whole idea of saying it has to be individualized, people are different, it varies person to person, that is one of those dangerous terms that will both be used by people who are very good and nuanced and absolute idiots. Who are selling you terrible ideas. And so when you are not sure which one you're dealing with, I always encourage you to push back and say, people differ on what variable and to what magnitude. That's my mini rant.
It's a great rant. And I'll even give those who might use those terms another option if they are unable to actually identify the source of variance and discuss the magnitude of that variance, because in many cases, in such times where you would use this terminology, you would not be able to quantify it. And what you are instead allowed to say is, I actually don't know, but I've observed this or experienced this, and all I know is that that's happened. I don't know what contributes to it. For example, hey, we've got robust data that indicates that at a strong diminishing relationship, at least in studies over the short term, that more volume of training, everything is held constant, seems to produce monotonic increases in muscle mass. Meaning it's not a dose response that's linear, but every little bit more you do, more does seem to be more, at least within the bounds of what we studied. If you go, well, hey, everybody's different. And I go, what do you mean? And you go, well, I know this guy who does low volume and he's big. Just say, hey, I have observed some things that don't seem to comport with this. Eric, or how do I reconcile the fact that there's a big guy who does low volume? And then we can have a discussion of how that's not at all in contradiction with the data, rather than just kind of hand-wavingly say, actually, this person's muscle grows more the less it's mechanically loaded.
Quite a claim.
Because that is probably not true.
Yeah. Imagine if they stopped training. Can you imagine the gains they would make?
As long as they kept the intensity of not training high.
Yes.
And what I expect is, I mean, your life needs to look, going all the way back to the start, like Frank McGrath on those Animal Pack posters, but just never lifting.
Yeah.
Intense life.
Yeah. Highest possible intensity, lowest possible dose of tension on the muscle.
I do so much volume that I do so little volume. I'm such an advocate to low volume training. I don't train.
Beautiful. All right, Helms. Well, honestly, I think I've said my piece about this topic. I think we've covered the paper in as much detail as any podcast audience would allow for a paper that's based on a lot of detailed mathematical modeling of metabolism. So is there anything else you want to say to the good people before we wrap up?
If you liked this podcast,
get help.
I like you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, yes. You'll probably see me in the same office. Yeah. We'll both be in the waiting room, and we can talk about our own struggles with conforming to normal society and relating to others, and then we can go get a workout in after our sessions.
Beautiful. All right. Well, folks, we love you. We appreciate you. Shout out to the live chat. Love everybody joining us on a Tuesday night Eastern time, Wednesday or Thursday or Friday in New Zealand. We're not really sure. There's not a lot of science on that, but really appreciate you joining in. And even if you're not in the live chat, if you happen to listen later, maybe you had a terrible emergency come up and just this one time you had to miss the live recording. Our thoughts are with you. Hope that emergency works out okay. We forgive it. Even if you're listening after the fact, as long as you listen at some point, we love you and we appreciate you. So folks, take care. Everyone have a fantastic week, and we will be back in 7 days with yet another episode of Iron Culture.